Okay. As that introduction made clear, I am not a medical professional in any way, nor am I a scientist. Instead, I come from a humanities background and looking at using literary theory and area studies theory to think about culture and how culture deals with and creates contexts and produces and reproduces itself as a system of meaning. Um, so that makes me different than a lot of the other people that you've been hearing who have been coming at these questions of what is the meaning of disease, what is the social reality of disease, what are the social negotiations involved with dealing with the disease from a kind of you start with the disease and then you see what happens around it kind of way. Well, I come at it from a different way. I want to look at the cultural mores and the social contexts through which that we talk about, know about, think about diseases at all. So in that sense, I want to take apart some of the things that become a subset in epidemiology, right? Where you have like, well, cultural mores too, lead to all these sorts of problems. I want to get into that particular subset of epidemiology and really look at what is the nature of representation, what is the nature of the languages we use to talk about and think about disease and our place within society in relationship to specific diseases. One of the most interesting comments I heard in the past presentations I was hearing was one yesterday by Dr. Cizilski, who talked about fear and the importance of fear. One of the things she talked about in the epidemiology of AIDS is that in the U.S., she diagnosed a certain lessening of fear within certain populations within the U.S. due to advanced methods of treatment that allow people to live longer with AIDS. So her thesis was that fear lessened, and therefore disease, it allowed a certain type of prophylactic function that the fear served to lessen as well, leading to a material rise in infections within certain groups. I thought that was a very interesting and inspiring thing to say, and what I'm interested in is the fact that fear is not a unitary thing to me, just like authoritarianism isn't, or government control isn't, or most anything that any of the categories that we've been talking about as interpretive categories for dealing with disease, so-called subjective ones or culturally determined ones are, again, also not monolithic. That it's not about fear, it's about fears. And so organizing my work on Japanese horror films, I want to look at a specific type of fear in relation to other ways of thinking about fear and see if there can be an ethics of reading fear, an ethics of thinking about fear, and an ethic, and which all revolves around really an ethics of feeling fear. So with that in mind, I want to see some horror movies. And so Japan is an odd place to start in a generalized global context of AIDS because its incidence of infection is extremely low when compared to really anywhere. Their blood donor population was historically clean even when it wasn't regulated, and its infection levels have remained in a percentage-wise compared to someplace like the U.S. much, much, much lower. And the rising rates of infection are nowhere near, for example, China's. But that was surprising for everyone. So what I do want to look at, though, is that because of the low rate of infection, because of some of the special circumstances of the Japanese case, it allows us to see how, because the way that AIDS impacted the public sphere, the way AIDS came to be talked about, followed very different routes than many other places where the infection rates follow the very classic type of epidemiology, such as the one that Dr. Zilski, who I can never remember the name of off the top of my head, outlined for us. It moved in a different way, and that's what I want to focus on, and how that affects how it got turned into a structure of feeling about disease, and a structure through which you felt something about disease or not. So the first thing I want to look at is give you a taste of what kind of movies I'm talking about. This movie is a movie obviously called Infection, or Kansen in Japanese. It came out in 2004, so it's a late part of the genre that I'm tracing. The reason why I'm picking it to look at is because, first of all, it speaks to the internationalization of this idiom of horror. J-horror, as some of you might have read in the pre-readings, is a specific subset within the larger field of the production of horror films in Japan. And it's one that has produced works that have been both distributed in America and remade to great popularity in America, including, I'll get into which ones, but including The Ring, for example, and The Grudge, an upcoming movie called Pulse that's coming out in July. And so in that sense, it has, it's a type of cultural production that is specific to Japan, but at the same time has implications for other places. So this particular movie, as you can see up there, and I lost my pointer. Well, anyway, you can read. It's the first in a series of movies called J-horror theater that is made in conjunction with an American production company called Lionsgate. So they're made for limited release within Japan, but then with an eye toward DVD sales in America. And that is specifically why they're being produced in the way they're being produced. So in other words, you're seeing a codification of a genre, a naming of it retroactively as J-horror, which is not, was not what, they were just horror movies when they were first being produced. And they allow us to have a little laboratory into what the producers of these things think are the essences of these genres that need to be reproduced in order to produce movies that read, again, as J-horror and therefore will be popular. So there's an industrial element to this that's very interesting. Okay, so this particular movie is kind of fun because it's a movie about, indeed, infection. So it's a very good way to get into these metaphors of disease, characteristic of these horror films. Within the movie, we have a hospital that is underfunded and sort of flailing around. You have a whole bunch of doctors who are overworked and underpaid, a whole bunch of nurses that are undertrained. So it's a dying hospital, basically. Because of this, there are a lot of mistakes that are made that then they decide need to be covered up. So one particular mistake, as we will see, involves a patient that has been burned all over his body. He goes through a cardiac event, and during the course of them responding to the cardiac event is injected with the wrong thing and is killed. So it's incompetence. They're afraid that if they report this, then the entire hospital will be shut down and all of them will be out of jobs. So instead they decide to put him in a room filled with heaters to decompose his body very, very quickly so it'd be impossible to trace what happened. So it's the course of the night while this is happening is the course of the movie. So what starts happening, the supernatural horror part of it, isn't that, oddly enough. It's the fact that people, the members of the hospital staff, one by one begin to be infected with a disease that, oh, I need to go back here, that turns their blood green and, see? And it starts to leak out so what's happening is that their insides are liquefying, and then they basically collapse into this pile of green goo. The other distinctive feature of this disease is that right before they do that, so the reason why we know that this gross thing is going to start happening is that the infected person starts to act in a way that's, in a trance-like way that works through feelings of guilt or incompetence that they have. So there's a nurse, for example, who is really bad at injecting things, and she has been trying to inject this one patient, and there's like lesions all over and stuff, and they were like, you really have to work through that. You can't do this to the patients. At least if you're gonna have to practice on yourself, she's told by another nurse. So then when she gets infected with this disease, she's shown with all of these needles all over her, like a sort of hyper reaction to an implied guilt or incompetence. So she's covered in hypodermic needles, and it's like, I'm practicing, and then she implodes. So what we're seeing, the clip I'm going to show you is a particularly interesting clip, I think, that shows what the disease looks like. So you're going to see a nurse who's under the influence of the disease, and then what she's doing as an overcompensation. Lights. So, if you can't tell, there's green blood taking over the red blood. Okay, I know, I'm such a tease. But for the purpose of this talk, it's not really important to see that she's connected to a different nurse who's narratively important, but not symbolically. Sorry. So you have, at one level, this level of representation that shows a very disturbing a mind and body invasion by an outside agent, and then something that is talked about in terms of the exchange of bodily fluids, but also, more importantly, I think, through the exchange of an interior of a body with another interior of a body. And also that the people who are involved in these matrices of exchange have no control over what they're doing. And in this particular narrative becomes an allegory about medical practice that becomes resonant later in my talk, but that's not as distinctive, I don't think, or it's differently distinctive. Not all of them happen in hospitals, for example, but this one happens too. Okay, so what is the nature of the disease, though? And this is where we get into the really distinctive part of what J-horror is talking about. So later on, our hero, doctor, runs out of that room. It's sort of like a haunted house kind of thing. So he sees it, and he's like, oh my God, runs away, and then encounters a senior doctor who he thought was gone. And then we get an explanation of what the nature of the disease actually is. Ta-da.
大変だ、早く逃げないと感染病が蔓延します。このままじゃ全滅だ。心配するな。全滅はしない。なぜあなただけ平然としてるんです。何か知ってるんですか。何を知ってるんだ。答えろ、この感染病は何なんだ。これはあなたが撒いたウイルスなのか。自分だけ血清でもって病院中感染していくのを観察したのか。そんなことはしていない。秋葉君、どんな感染ルートをたどったかよく考えろ。どういう意味だ。忘れたのか。君たちが3号室に集まっていた時、私は近くにいた。近くにいたんだよ、秋葉君。決して眠ってなんかいなかった。あった。 感染病とどういう関係があるんだ。私たちが取った行動に罰を与えた。そう言いたいのか。事故だった。事故だったんだ。誰も悪くはないんだ。悪くないさ。してしまったことは仕方ない。あいつが死ぬ。悪いのはその後だ。その後だよ、秋葉君。自分たちが犯した罪をなかったことにしたことだ。ウイルスは飛沫感染などしない。意識に感染するんだ。夢の中で映っている。
Yeah, so now we know. Um, what I'm looking at is, as you can see in my little kind of genealogy, this movie is actually very, very late. And what I'm saying is that it's codifying a lot of things that were sort of nascent in this strain of J-horror that became very popular within Japan and has become internationally popular. So it began really with Parasite Eve to a certain extent, and then really took off with the double feature. It's a movie and its sequel, but they were released very close to one another, of Ringu and Dasen. The yellow highlighting indicates movies that have been made into American versions. So in other words, have been completely remade. All of these movies have been distributed in America, and all of them are available on DVD. But then there's The Ring, The Grudge, Pulse, Will Soon Be, and Dark Water have all been remade with American actors and with the help of Hollywood, as you say. What's interesting to me about these things is that, first of all, the reason why I group them in a specific way has to do with the way that their narratives are structured. I think that one of the distinctive parts of them is this willingness to treat disease as both a problem of the body, but also a problem of consciousness. And there's very little work being done to make the two come together in some sort of logical way. So there's very little explanation in these movies about how the mechanisms spreading these viruses, of these haunted viruses, actually work. So for example, Parasite Eve is about mitochondria, which we all have in our bodies, but are talked about as if they are primordial beings that crawled into our cells in prehistory and have been riding along ever since and have their own agenda. So they are slowly plotting throughout the film to confederate and take over the bodies of their hosts. And what happens is that one of them is in the body of this beautiful woman, and she seduces this and marries this prominent medical researcher who can culture cells in livers very quickly. So she's thinking of him basically as someone who can propagate mitochondria, her brethren, at a rate fast enough they can have a critical mass to take over the world. And that's what happens. The idea, so that's the logic, right, of the story. What happens in the storytelling is that you have no real explanation of how she communicates the mitochondria in her avatar, how it communicates with the mitochondria in other people. There's no real talking about how the mitochondria get activated in these other people. So you have puddles of water that people touch, and then they get infected and what's the word? Possessed by this infection, this other consciousness, and their body rebels and has another agenda for them, sort of pushing their humanity out as it goes along. And this is very, and The Ring, which how many people have seen at least the American Ring? Okay, what happens in the American Ring? Anybody? In the American version, so the idea, the part that you guys haven't quite vocalized yet is the fact that what do? You watch something, right? So you're infected by this VCR tape, right? That you come into accidental contact with, and then you have 7 days, and then you're going to die, right? Um, and then what we find out, well, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so you have these technological means of replication of this haunting that spreads precisely like a disease. And it's implicit in the American version that it's a virus. It's explicit in the Japanese version of the movie that's a virus. And it's talked about in medical terms in the book that it's based on, which was written in 1991 by a doctor, that talks about how the haunting actually affects cells and makes a virus. And there's, in the sequel to it, there's actually a picture that he facsimilates of a little petri dish with the ring virus. So in other words, it's explicitly a viral metaphor, as is Parasite Eve, which was originally written by a biomedical engineer before he became a best-selling author. So the roots of J-horror are specifically using scientific and disease, and specifically disease or like culturation and that kind of thing, these tropes as ways to talk about fear. Okay, I now want to make a little transition and start talking about what was happening in Japan in the public sphere around the time that these movies started to become extremely popular. One of the main characteristics of the 90s in Japan was the revelation of a series of government scandals that had been happening both in the economic sphere, like pretty much any sphere you can think of. There was a lot of high-level corruption and collusion between government interests and corporate interests that were discovered because of a change that happened in the politics, where the Socialist Party got partial control over the heads of ministries and things like that. So investigations were done that wouldn't have been done under the Liberal Democratic Party. So one of these scandals has to do with HIV-tainted blood products that were distributed to hemophiliacs during the 90s. Okay, so what is the deal with that? So hemophiliacs number at about 4,500 to 5,000 in Japan. So they're a fairly small, they're a small group. Globally, they're extremely small, right? But they're, even within Japan, they're a small group. However, they're a confederated group that has a certain amount of political sway and has an advocacy group, for example, and is able to confederate and have lawsuits, present petitions to the government, for example. And this is what was happening during the beginning of the AIDS crisis, the global AIDS crisis that was occurring in the mid-'80s. So in terms of treating hemophilia, the first big breakthrough in hemophilia treatment was the development in the mid-'60s of something called cryoprecipitate. That was a blood product that people were able to use that allowed them to live much longer and something approaching normal lives. But they still had to go into hospitals all the time, and it was still very inhibiting to them. But this was not just blood, so it used to be dependent on blood products before that, which is a very inefficient way of replacing the blood that was lost by hemophiliacs. So this blood plasma aided in clotting and helped to make them able to live better. But then in the mid-'70s, a new technological advance happened where certain factors were able to be isolated from blood plasma and create these products that could be taken both prophylactically and therapeutically. So in other words, you could take them to ensure that you wouldn't bleed to death in public, or you could take it if something bad happened to you. So because of this, hemophiliacs began to see themselves as a group that were able to advocate for specific availabilities of treatments and modifications in the way that they had been administered by the government and hospitals that had earlier conscripted their ability to even travel or do anything. So one of the major things that happened because of this political advocacy is that they became able to purchase their own blood products and keep them in their houses and not have to go into the hospital every time to find them. So this was a big revolution in the daily lives of hemophiliacs, and also upped the consumption of blood products by hemophiliacs to levels that had never been anywhere near where they had been before. Okay, so how are these blood products made? So in Japan, right after the war, the whole blood distribution was still a for-profit business that was dominated by a company called Green Cross, which was headed by people who were actually former war criminals that the occupation allowed to be in these positions for reasons of continuity. So they sort of took a blind eye to the fact that these people had received their medical training participating in war medical experiments on POWs that constituted war crimes. So a lot of these people were still there's still that taint happening when people think about the Green Cross. They were running they dominated in the immediate post-war, so the 50s, the distribution of all blood. Then, with the formation of the Japanese Red Cross, and then later legal developments, whole blood became segregated from that. So whole blood could no longer be a for-profit business for anyone, and it was dominated by the nonprofit group, the Japanese Red Cross. However, at the same time that was happening, there was a distinction made between whole blood transfusions, and the distribution of blood plasma, which was classified as a pharmaceutical. So therefore, Green Cross still controlled the distribution and controlled the profits being made from the distribution and selling of blood plasma products. Because of this, during the and the other thing is that there was a disincentive to use domestically produced blood plasma because there was a higher profit margin. But the way that the medical system works in Japan, because it's semi-socialized, the doctors, or the hospitals and the doctors and the pharmaceutical companies all pay different fees and then get reimbursed, right? So under government regulations, you get reimbursed the same amount no matter where you get the blood plasma. But so if you get it from someplace cheaper, you make more money as an medical organization than if you use a higher cost one. So that was sort of the milieu that was occurring when the AIDS crisis suddenly burst on the scene. Because of this, there was a disincentive to use domestic, and therefore now we know cleaner, because the donor pool was cleaner, blood plasma. Instead, they bought it from what is now the Bayer Corporation in America, and then some other pharmaceutical companies in America who are having their own problems with HIV infection. Because the way the blood plasma is made is that you have a huge donor pool that's all mixed together, and then you get the plasma out of it. So one hemophiliac consuming one plasma product is coming into contact with thousands of people every time. So that makes the infection rate, well, you can see. Yeah, you don't have to be a math major to know that. So you have this. So there was this scandal that happened because one of two. So there's the disincentive to buy domestic blood plasma, and then also the disincentive to buy the newly developed pasteurized blood plasma, which was then being under the process of being shown to be safe. So if you treated it, if you pasteurized it, basically, it would neutralize the HIV that might be in it. But that was a newer technology and obviously more expensive. And so there was a scandal that came to light starting in the early 90s, by which people realized that the Green Cross and the Ministry of Health and Welfare, which shared officials, for example, like officials from one would retire and have positions in the other, had a too cozy relationship, and then therefore were not regulating enough, and therefore were recommending to groups like the advocacy groups for the hemophiliacs that they not petition the government to mandate the distribution of pasteurized blood products, but instead would keep with the unheated ones were fine, they were better, which was, of course, not true. This resulted in the infection of over half of the population of hemophiliacs in Japan. So, and because of the low rates of infections in other areas through what we think of as high-risk groups like drug users and male homosexuals and sex workers and all of that stuff, because those groups were still relatively untouched by the global AIDS crisis, The hemophiliacs also statistically were this huge bulge in the people who were infected with HIV in 90s Japan. So what this resulted in, so that was the sort of late 80s, early 90s milieu. And then what happened is that these lawsuits started, but the legal processes in Japan are notoriously extremely slow, much slower than here. And they were just sort of being clogged in the court systems and moving around until the governmental changes in the mid-90s resulted in internal investigations that uncovered evidence that could be used in those lawsuits, but more importantly, created a media sensation, putting political pressure on the judges involved to actually act as partial advocates for the hemophiliacs. So they came back, and in 1996, as it says up there is both monetary and actual like officials apologizing, that type of compensation as well, that was being awarded, which is something that almost never happens in Japan. There are many problems that come to a legal level but are left unresolved to this day, such as the comfort women issue and issue of Koreans in Japan and Hansen's disease. Many of these things are left unresolved for basically in perpetuity. And so the fact that the hemophiliacs were able to win this very public victory and to expose this huge scandal in the mid-90s was extremely important. Somewhat outsized importance considering the pool of people and the scope of the problem within society. And so people were actually indicted criminally and given jail terms as well, which is like former heads of the Green Cross, which is now defunct. So it brought down a corporation. It indicted these very, very important people who were basically invulnerable, and became a huge media sensation. So what effects does this have on the way that AIDS is thought about in general in Japan? For one thing, it abetted the already prevalent tendency to think that foreigners and foreign blood and foreign contamination is the natural cause of AIDS, and if we just sort of keep ourselves, clean, then this wouldn't happen. So that means that when you get into talking about high-risk groups, like people who I was going to say use, is that the right word? Who either use drugs or also who cavort with sex workers from all over, or who are homosexuals, are talked about not in terms of their behaviors internally are being specifically high risk, but the fact that their behaviors bring them into contact with foreigners. So you get drugs from foreign people, you get you have international gay communities that have regular tourists going through them, and so contact with Americans and other, especially Americans, but dirty people. And also internally, many of the sex workers in Japan are not Japanese citizens and are not ethnically Japanese, and so there was a definite coding of them as dirty as well, and an attempt to trace the origin of AIDS to people like this one specific Filipina sex worker, for example. Which is all rather specious and, more than that, very politically motivated on the part of the government, who is very devoted to having the ideal of a homogenous nation that would be able to be defended. The other thing, though, so that's a very classic kind of way of thinking about the metaphors of AIDS, right? I gave you the pre-reading about with Susan Sontag, and that's one of the things she talks about, that the AIDS in America as well is talked about with military and invasion metaphors. So we'll get back to that, but that's a very classic way. The distinctive thing for me is the identity politics that happened when the hemophiliacs entered the scene. So hemophiliacs became the face of HIV for this reason, and they became it in a specific way. So they have almost no culpability. They have no culpability in terms of they did something and then there was supposedly no risk in anything that they did. So in other words, they didn't deserve it in a very specific way. so because they became the face of AIDS, the identity politics that happened in this country about AIDS activism and HIV positive and living with HIV and prevention programs never really took off. Because what sort of prevention programs are you going to have for someone who depends on these blood products that they don't have the control of the means of production for in order to live their daily lives? At the same time, Hansen's disease, which is the modern way of referring to leprosy, their advocacy groups were engaging in identity politics and they finally pressed around the same time the repeal of anti-leprosy laws that had restricted their movement around the country to these islands. So they were forced to be in sanitaria up until like 1996 or 7. So they were all over the news at the same time as the hemophiliacs. The hemophiliacs were one of their most vocal faces, I guess, is a 19-year-old boy named Kawada Ryuichi, who became very vocal. And, he's a young, fresh-faced boy who doesn't seem to deserve anything. And there was very little rhetoric about overcoming revulsion, for example, in conjunction with hemophiliacs. Whereas Hansen's disease are very disfigured, and they became a different type of face of disease and discrimination. So the way that things slotted out in the public imaginary is that you had these beautiful hemophiliacs who were infected with HIV through these huge webs of international corruption, and then you had these Hansen's disease sufferers who were sort of terrible to look at, but also beautiful because they were advocating their own type of innocence and their own identity based on disease. And then the gay movement in Japan is very marginalized in public discourse. And so on the one hand, you have spectacularized representations of gay entertainers and things like that in the media, but the political movement is, while there, is shunted to the side of mainstream society, and also identified with the American movement. So the people who are politically active in the gay movement in Japan are seen to have close ties to like international movements for gay rights, and so therefore are tainted in this specific way and are not considered to be, not talked about in terms of their Japaneseness. They're talked about in terms of their rights, just like resident Koreans and people like that are. So in other words, they fulfilled, in relation to AIDS, a completely different force than we think about, rhetorics of inclusion having to do with these so-called high-risk groups. So what? So now I have to bring the two things together, right? We have horror movies speaking in a specific way. We have a public arena that is structured in a specific way. How do we read one and get at the other? So one of the ways that I want to talk about to propose is metaphor. Susan Sontag talks about the importance of any kind of metaphor in thinking about anything. That's where she comes from. So the way that we relate to anything involves a displacement of representation. So the way I think about water has to do with its metaphorical import having to do with cooling, or maybe any sort of associations that you want, and those are all culturally determined and something that you can pull apart. Her intervention into the metaphor of AIDS and the metaphors of disease have to do with what she thinks are harmful metaphors deployed in relation to AIDS. So when you talk about AIDS, you have to go through these metaphors, and that has impeded our ability to think outside of the metaphors and think of other ways of dealing with them as a society. So that she calls this reading against interpretation. So everybody interprets in order to think, but sometimes you have to resist those ways of thinking, those ways of meaning making, in order to make new meanings, is her point. And I find that very practical and very inspiring, really, in terms of how to think about how cultural representation relates to the day-to-day lives of people. But I also find it a little bit limiting in the sense that she sets out, you have a unitary metaphor, then you have a unitary signified, and how they relate to each other is just like this, right? And then you can slot them away and then replace it with something else, but it's not a system. So I want to be able to, these horror movies, I think, are a chain of signification that add up to something that we call, in my biz, a trope, which is a chain of symbols that interact and become a larger symbol, right? But how do you get at not just reading a symbol and its internal logic, but also its referentiality to the outside? Sometimes it's very hidden and is not as straightforward as the infection movie, for example, which is a surprisingly one-to-one type of correlation. So I want to talk about, just briefly introduce, so the ideas and the political consciousness of the metaphor, to expand it and to complexify it with the idea of the anagram, which the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure developed in his work, actually talking about like ancient Indian poetry, and he would look at them and see that there was repeated vowel sounds, and if you put them together, they'd be names of gods. And whether that's true or not is sort of beside the point for me, since that's not my thing. But the idea that you have a hidden code within something that seems straightforwardly about something else, I think is very useful in terms of complex systems like movies or like novels or intertexts, so movies that are based on novels, novels that refer to other novels, and of course, beyond that, movies and types of fictional production that refer to and take on meanings from the non-fictional world. So I want to be able to fuse the anagram and the metaphor and the ideas behind both to be able to read horror movies and see many of the references and the intertexts that we can trace. Okay, so here's my anagram of fear. J-horror and its relationship to disease seems to fall into some different types of pattern. First, you have a sort of subset of infection. So you have your body being invaded by something. As we saw in the infection movie, you have blood being circulated, and that is the main locus of fear. So your body is going to be, its integrity is going to be violated, and your ability to control it will be violated, which will become important later. Also, you have haunting as invasion. So you have the Gothic trope of the return of the repressed, or the haunting. So you have a ghost or supernatural presence, but how they move is an invasion of the body, right? So how you are haunted is something that you take in some way, either by hearing, seeing, or actually invading your body, and that is paralyzing and frightening and either leads it to death or to actions that you wouldn't otherwise take. So then we get into transmission. How does the virus get passed from person to person? So you have technologies, I call them technologies and networks, but so in some movies, so you have The Ring that has the watching the tape. You have a movie that we'll talk about a little bit called One Missed Call, where the agent is a cell phone. You have The Grudge, where the agent is actually all the public networks that make you walk into this particular house. So you're a public health worker, you're a member, you're a policeman walking around, you are a family member, all these sorts of somewhat arbitrary reasons for you to enter this space that then infects you. And then, just like a disease, there's always an originary trauma, a place where something horrible usually happens to a little girl and is reworked and becomes a haunting that then is transferred like a virus. And there's usually a revelation scene that is that works to explain where it comes from. So it's sort of like, well, where did AIDS come from? Well, we have all these theories. It's a little bit like that. Also, you have a tendency to have one type of explanation and think that it works, and then at the end have a revelation that no, what you thought was true is not true, and the infection will still go on. So that's important too. And so then you have what I would call culturing, or culture, the reproduction of culture, and at the cultural level. So you have an idea of who is innocent and who is culpable in these narratives. The heroes are always innocent, and they almost they just don't do anything wrong. They stumble into these spaces of infection, or stumble into these come into contact with these technologies of infection through no fault of their own. They also aren't really able to do anything about it. All they do is find out about it and try to warn people who then subsequently die. Um, and then, as the epistemology works, as the knowing more and more about it progresses, you usually get back to the originary trauma. And in a classical horror paradigm, that would be a type of catharsis. So you'd either find a way from that to stop it, or the actual knowledge itself, like in a fairy tale, would make it okay. So you have a magical problem, so why not have a magical solution? What happens, though, is that you have this revelation. We all know why, kind of, these things, where it came from, and yet it still then is shown going on. So almost none of these movies, unlike the pre-reading that I gave you, one of the major problems with that particular article, the J-horror article, is that he has a throwaway comment about there's always the obligatory happy ending. What he means, I think, is that you have like this pop song come on at the end, and you have things like that. What you don't have, but to me, there's no way you can interpret the ending of any of these movies as anything but the end of the world. Because what they are is talking about how an infection moves from person to person. It's completely arbitrary, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So all it does is replicate. So we'll talk about that. But so the idea of agency becomes very compromised. If you're innocent and you're in a complete system that you're unable to change, then what can you do about it? Like, what is your role in this world, and in this milieu of invasion and bodily compromise? And so, of course, then we get to the end of the world. So how much time do I have left? Like, I can't read the clock. 10 minutes? Okay. So we'll go through some of these movies to give you a flavor of how some of the things that I've outlined get worked through. So here's Parasite Eve, which I talked about before, where you have mitochondria as a foreign agent in your blood. You have science that is corrupted for its inhuman ends, so for the end of mankind, basically. And you have a violation of agency in the sense that you are no longer, these people who are infected, whose mitochondria become activated by contact with the mother mitochondria, are no longer able, they're possessed, basically. They're unable to act on their own behalf, and sometimes the mitochondria themselves, she can make them overproduce energy, so they burst into flames, which is definitely against, the wishes of the host. So here we have the avatar. So she is the mitochondria speaking through the woman that has been possessed. Oops, that's not what I want to do. はしないで。これは進化なの。この子から生まれる子が本当のミトコンドリアイブになるの。
もういないのか。
私に気づいたから。だから車を運転しているとき、神経を刺激して事故を起こさせたの。
So that's how she took over the body, by instigating a car crash.
でもよかったわ。あなたは思った通り、私を培養してくれた。その上素敵な子宮も手に入った。さようなら、人間ども。
All right. The end of the world. So that particular avatar gets vanquished when he decides to hug her, and then they all burn up. However, the idea there's the implication at the end of it that people are still doing the same type of research and will again discover and reawaken the mitochondria in all of us, and it will be the end of the world again. One Missed Call is my favorite of these movies by Miike Takashi. It's the one with the cell phone, and what happens, the reason why it's random is because you have a cell phone that is then dialed without the notion after the person dies. Cell phone is dialed, and the number is generated by scrolling through the people who are stored in the cell phone, right? So whoever you've ever come in contact with or happen to get the phone number of is vulnerable to this type of infection. So there's that. So we'll watch a good death scene.
Yoko? Yoko, what's going on?
Sorry, that's dubbed. Anyway.
Yoko! Yoko!
All right. Well, as you can see, there's not a lot of agency going on with the control of the body there, with the disembodied hand. And then this is the ring, which is one of my last clips, which, as we talked about, is the what we find out through our epistemology is that the solution to this viral infection is that you have to show someone else within the 7 days, the infected film. Then they get infected, but your infection is magically solved. This means that you have a type of solving, right? But at the same time, it's still talking about the end of the world. So here's the end of the Japanese version, which differs a bit from the American ending. Oops.
お父さん？うん、今からそっちに行くから。お願いがあるの。陽一のためなの。
That's her son.
呪いのビデオってさ、死なない方法があるんだって。1週間以内にダビングした他の人に見せるの。じゃあ見せられた人はまたダビングして見せるのよ。1週間以内に。
それじゃ切りないじゃん。
そうそう、切りないのよ。でも死にたくなかったらやるでしょ。
So you can see the gathering storms. That's actually how that's the last lines in the novel as well, end with the storm clouds gathering above her. This one's very interesting because instead of being a generalized apocalypse where everyone dies, you have instead a population of endlessly infected people, right? So it's very clear kind of parallel with HIV with a little bit of the culpability built into it because you have to show it to someone else, but that the social relations that facilitate that are not coded in any way. They can be any social relation or an arbitrary one or a stranger. So, what's up with that? So, I've talked a lot about metaphor and meaning. So, what are the ethics of types of fear? So these are types of fears that absolve the person who is fearful, right? You have a fear of being embedded in an international and corporatist world in which you have no control over the production of anything that you consume into your body. And therefore, it's both extremely frightening, yet oddly comforting in a fatalist kind of way. Because what can you do? How no one can ever point at you and say that you did something wrong or that you have any control over these things that are happening to you. Which leads me to what I briefly touched on with the hemophiliacs as the face of AIDS within Japan, which has created the idea that you have these saints who are, through no fault of their own, target population for all of these social ills that are converging upon them that HIV is the precipitate of. So then you have, it also becomes a way of thinking about transnational transmission. So they're being remade all the time. So I'd like to take this opportunity to think about why this particular Japanese formation would be popular here. Do we have resonances here with these types of fears and how they relate to our regulation of our own bodies and what that would mean? And also the idea of international systems and foreign agents. So these are narratives about foreign agents being introduced into your blood, which obviously can be extrapolated very quickly into a national metaphor for policies of expulsion and things like that, which indeed there's a rightward turn in Japan that is fostering some of these ideas, the ideas the foreigners are infectious. And then my favorite part, which is the pleasures of contemplating the apocalypse. And I think this actually has the most political edge to it. So when I talk about the viral sublime, what the sublime means is contemplating something that's so much larger than you that it takes you out of your own humanity and then puts you back into it. So in other words, the classical sublime is looking at something like a landscape, which is so awesome and so inhuman that it becomes a pleasure it becomes a fearful type of pleasure, which is how Kant talks about it. So you reach the edge of your humanity and then are thrown back into it and becomes a way of thinking about transcendence. In the viral sublime, what you're being brought up against are these networks of viral transmission that that you have no control over, and there's no way to really stop in any definitive kind of way. And so the other trope that happens in these movies is the idea of the ordinary being mixed with the extraordinary. So you have these ordinary lives that are filmed in extremely dismal kind of ways. If you ever watched The Ring, it's dominated by grays and really boring scenes. The things that aren't boring in these movies are these moments of bodily problematic, or these talking about the metaphors of what's really happening underneath the calm surface, dreary surface, and perhaps miserable surface of your daily life. So in other words, like in Dark Water, if you've seen either the American remake or it's true of both, that you have water dripping down in this horrible tenement building that she's forced to move into, and that the only real color in that movie is the talisman of horror, which is this haunted purse, which is bright red. And so it's the only red that's in it. And so then you get into what are the ethics of this type of fear? What are the ethics implied in this type of fear? One of the problems that epidemiologists talking about Japan have talked about is a complacency about AIDS prevention methods within Japan. So they take surveys and nobody's using condoms, for example, or very, very, very low percentages of people are using condoms. Yet infection rates are still, even though they're still low, are actually going up, especially in the heterosexual population. So even though the fallout from the hemophiliac problem and the preponderance of the high-risk group of the male homosexuals within the population of people who are infected have dominated the statistics, the one that's growing is heterosexual. And so epidemiologists are talking about how, for some reason, in Japan, people are extremely complacent about their day-to-day lives in relationship to preventing disease. And I think that is related to the types of fears and the type of talking about fear that I see also working in these movies. I think I should stop now.
I was just wondering, do you think that the genre of the movies is a direct result of the cultural significance of Japan, in which to boldly denounce or to boldly attack certain concepts is not considered proper? So they use the medium of entertainment as displacing some of their political unrest?
No. I don't think that. I think that all cultures everywhere deal with political problems through their mass culture. I think we do. I think that everywhere does. And I don't think there's anything distinctive about that particular thing. What I think is distinctive is the nature of the fear that is being presented and worked through. I think that has to do, again, with the distinctiveness, not of the Japanese predilection toward indirection, which I think is a myth, but rather the nature of what, how HIV, this particular fear of disease and how it emerged into the scene. So people weren't fearful about things that we were fearful of, like the wrong sexual partner or that kind of thing, just as long as they kept themselves domestic, you know. There was that idea.